Liberal or conservative, male or female, young or old, Americans love to bash the news media. Once among the nation's most trusted institutions, the news media have fallen from grace. According to Gallup, even as recently as 2000, a majority of Americans trusted the press. By 2015, it had fallen to 40%, and lower than that, 36% among those 18 to 49. It's hard to see how this decline will be reversed. The industry has become politically polarized, and in the highly competitive age of multiple 24-hour cable news channels and the internet, it's under severe financial pressure. And this compounds an even deeper problem: failing journalistic standards. In the 1950s, the media universe consisted mainly of a few national television broadcast networks and local TV and radio stations, most of which got much of their news from major wire services and the nation's large newspapers. Most journalists were committed to producing objective journalism, fact-based stories independent of the government and of political parties. A reporter's job was to report, not offer opinion or advocate. Presented with the facts, it was up to readers to make their own judgments about news events. Opinions were supposed to be confined to editorial and op-ed pages. That world no longer exists. This lack of objectivity and the decline of standards is one reason, though not the only one, why newspapers and news magazines are a declining industry. According to Pew Research, print revenue from newspaper sales has declined from $47 billion in 2006 to $16 billion in 2014. Digital sales haven't come close to making up the difference. Most papers have been forced to cut operating expenses, slash staff, and close bureaus, overseas in particular. Ironically, there are more stories than ever to cover, and fewer staff than ever to cover them. This lack of information from professional journalists has been filled by a new source: social media and the blogosphere. When the Iraq War, which I covered for the New York Times, began in 2003, there were roughly 100,000 bloggers. Only a few years later, there were an estimated 27 million. The Internet as a news source has obvious pluses and minuses. On the plus side is that information is spread widely and instantly. The minuses have to do with the fact that the quality of reporting varies dramatically. It's not easy to separate the wheat from the chaff. Furthermore, many sites, including mainstream sites, have abandoned traditional journalistic practices and standards in search of more and more eyeballs. Objectivity, once the gold standard of reporting, is now often seen as old-fashioned, a ratings loser. When success is measured mainly in terms of clicks, the outrageous beats the sober just about every time. Inserting opinion, even in the middle of a news story, is a way in which journalists can distinguish themselves. And in mainstream media outlets, those opinions overwhelmingly tend to be liberal. This might not be so bad if journalists acknowledged their bias, but they almost never do. Yet the bias is obvious. According to a 2014 study by 2 Indiana University professors, reporters who identify as Democrats outnumber those who identify as Republicans by 4-1, 28% to 7%. The remaining 65% call themselves independent, but based on my long experience as a reporter, this is a fiction. That is, many reporters like to describe themselves as independent, but they're not. Not really. By any fair measure, this group is overwhelmingly on the political left. The obvious liberal bias has only served to push conservative readers to those sources that cater to conservative themes, further polarizing the media landscape. And unable to attract conservatives, the mainstream media have chosen to double down on views and themes that appeal to their liberal constituency. To give just one example, when Fox News broke a story in January 2016 about the discovery of top-secret intelligence on the private email server that Hillary Clinton used while Secretary of State, classified information which she had denied ever having sent or received. The New York Times buried this news story deep inside the paper. A decline in reporting standards, a decline in revenue, an increase in bias have made many wary of the people who provide them with their news. A certain amount of skepticism is a healthy thing, but a thriving democracy depends on a dynamic and free press. As much as people may like to bash the media, most people would far prefer to trust it. I'm Judith Miller, contributing editor of City Journal for Prager University.
Who's the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court? My guess is that most Americans would answer Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's so famous now that she's often referred to by just her initials, RBG. Elevated to the High Court by President Bill Clinton in 1993, the left-leaning Justice Ginsburg was the subject of not one, but 2 movies in 2018 alone. But she isn't the first female Supreme Court justice. She's the second. The first doesn't have a movie named after her. That's because Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan. We hear a lot about the Year of the Woman, the Women's March, and the war against women. But if the major media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, CBS, and others, were more interested in accuracy than advocacy, it would be that they are promoting the Year of the Leftist Woman, or the Leftist Women's March. The major media like to pretend that all women think alike and that conservative women are just the exception that proves the rule. But according to a 2018 Pew Research study, about 1/3 of women are Democrats, a little less than 1/3 are Republican, and a little more than 1/3 are independents. So if there are all these conservative women around, how does the media make it seem like they barely exist? They use 3 strategies. The first is omission. If you don't see something, you don't have to deal with it. Open up a glossy magazine. Every liberal woman is glamorized, stylishly dressed, beautifully photographed. Their personal stories are almost always an inspirational version of Joan of Arc. They have overcome overwhelming obstacles to make the world a more compassionate and tolerant place. Glamour magazine recognized 11 Democrat women among their 2018 Women of the Year. No Republican made the cut. First Lady Michelle Obama was on the cover of Vogue 3 times. First Lady and former fashion model Melania Trump? So far, not once. Every now and again, the major media will do a story about a female conservative to balance things out. But let's be honest, it's not balance, it's tokenism. The second strategy the media uses to diminish conservative women is mocking. Making fun of a woman's appearance discounts what she says. You would think the major media would resist this kind of objectification, but they don't, not if the target is a conservative woman. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, and Kellyanne Conway, the first woman to run a winning presidential campaign, are routinely belittled for their hair, their eye makeup, or their weight. Their significant accomplishments, in contrast, are rarely acknowledged. Why? Because the media doesn't like their boss, and it treats women who work for him as traitors to their sex. The third strategy the media uses to demean conservative women is labeling. Using stereotypes precludes there being a valid reason for conservative women to hold the positions they do. The major media simply can't accept that conservatives have serious and important reasons for their beliefs, so they have to come up with answers to explain this seeming anomaly to themselves. These women must be racist or self-hating or just weak-minded. Here's how Barbara Streisand put it to the Daily Mail in England. A lot of women vote the way their husbands vote. They don't believe enough in their own thoughts. Labeling, like the strategies of mocking or omission, is just another way to display contempt and demonize conservative women. Its purpose is to persuade you to not treat those being labeled with respect, to ignore their ideas, and to even avoid associating with them. Not surprisingly, the vilification that results discourages a lot of conservative-leaning women from running for political office, or even from speaking up. Who needs that grief? It takes a strong person to swim against the media tide. But here's the thing about swimming against the tide. It makes you stronger. Maybe that's why Nikki Haley can stand up in the UN and tell the truth, or why Candace Owens can question the devotion to progressive policies that have so hurt blacks, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali can take on the cause of truly oppressed women, those living in radical Islamist societies. We need these voices and more like them. That's why it's so important to encourage a more respectful, inclusive debate. We should want everyone at the table, both sides of the political spectrum, listening with civility. That way we can be better informed and make better decisions. So if you hold conservative views, you have a particularly important role to play. You need to speak out to your friends, your family, and your coworkers. Let them hear your thinking, and then let them make up their own minds. The media may pretend you don't exist. They may even mock or label you. They want to intimidate you into silence. That's not fair, and that's not right. Don't let them. I'm Heather Higgins, chairman of Independent Women's Forum for Prager University.
You've probably heard a lot of people recently screaming and yelling about fake news. Charges fly from all points on the political spectrum. This story is mistaken. It's fake news. That statement is incorrect. It's fake news. But to my mind, these arguments miss the point. Mainstream American news is all fake because the major news outlets are so consistently biased toward the left that whether any given story they report is factual or not, their overall reportage is essentially leftist propaganda. You can complain about the right-wing slant of Fox News all you want, but left-wing ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, and CNN have combined almost 10 times the viewers. Look, the chief journalist at ABC is former Clinton operative George Stephanopoulos. The president of CBS News is David Rhodes, the brother of a former senior Obama staffer. Comcast, which owns NBC, is run by a major Democrat donor. Same for the leadership at CBS and Time Warner, which owns CNN. Only 7% of American journalists identify as Republican. And while a lot of news outlets forbid their reporters to donate to candidates, 96% of those who did donate last time out gave to Hillary Clinton. These journalists claim that despite the fact they're all Democrats, they can be objective. It just ain't so. Psychologists have shown that when people associate almost exclusively with those who agree with them, they suffer from groupthink and confirmation bias and lose their ability to see events clearly. Now, it's not that these journalists are liars, exactly. It's that their bias skews their reporting in very specific ways. Let me give you Andrew Klavan's 3 rules of mainstream media journalism. These can transform any story, whether it's true or not, into fake news. Rule number 1. Whenever left-wing prejudices are confirmed by a single event, that event is treated as representative. But whenever left-wing prejudices are contradicted by a single event, that event is treated as an isolated incident. And if you treat it as representative, you are deemed to be hateful. So for instance, a white cop shoots a black suspect. The mainstream media treats that story as representative of general police racism, even though studies show cops don't use deadly force more often on blacks than on whites. On the other hand, if a Muslim commits an act of terrorism and someone is bold enough to point out that the terrorist act is in fact representative of the daily acts of Muslim terror around the world, this is considered Islamophobic. The leftist media cherry picks when an event illustrates a larger narrative. That's fake news. Rule number 2. When a scandal breaks on the right, the news is the scandal. When a scandal breaks on the left, the news is who wrongfully disclosed that scandalous information. Thus, when the media wanted to raise suspicions that Donald Trump was somehow in league with the Russians, they freely quoted illegally leaked information from intelligence sources. But when Congressman Devin Nunes announced he had information that the Obama administration might have misused intelligence against Donald Trump's transition team, the story became, how did Nunes get that information? And did he do it legally? The scandal meter is heavily weighted to fall to the right. Fake news. Rule number 3. Individual extremists on the right are highlighted, but the overall extremism of the left is ignored. In one of the fakest fake news stories in recent history, the mainstream media rose up as one to tar conservative Tea Party members as racist, when all they really wanted were lower taxes and less government spending. Reporters gave the Tea Party disparaging nicknames, represented their almost universally peaceful gatherings as ugly and violent. And whenever an individual Tea Partier said something wrong, it was cited as evidence that the movement itself was tainted. Meanwhile, the continually violent, vandalizing, anti-Semitic socialist movement that went by the name of Occupy Wall Street was hailed by journalists as an important social development, right up to the moment it vanished without a trace, except for the piles of litter its protesters left behind. Peaceful Tea Partiers wanted the small government prescribed by the Constitution, so they were radicals. Violent occupiers wanted the widespread government intrusion of socialism, so they were heroes. Very fake news. Newsweek editor Evan Thomas was once criticized when his magazine essentially convicted some white Duke University lacrosse players of raping a black woman. A rape it turns out they did not commit because it didn't happen. Thomas defended himself, saying, "The narrative was right, but the facts were wrong." The mainstream media almost always get their left-wing narrative right, whether the facts support it or not. That's called confirming your own prejudices. It's called bias. It's called fake news. I'm Andrew Klavan for Prager University.
If you're a movie buff, you've probably seen a picture of a director, thumbs joined together, index fingers forming a square, showing the camera operator how to frame the shot. The camera can't see everything, right? The art of directing is framing every shot so the audience sees exactly what the director wants them to see. We all do something like this in making arguments, whether personal or political. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We only have so much time to make our points. But there is a downside. Often, arguments end up unfairly skewed by the information they include or leave out. If you understand how framing works, you'll have a better chance of seeing through weak arguments and appreciating good ones. Let's look at some examples. Take socialism. Socialism is enjoying renewed popularity, especially among young people. Why is this, given the failure of the socialist model in places like the former Soviet Union, Cuba, and Venezuela? The answer is that socialism has been very cleverly framed by its proponents. Socialism, we are told, is morally superior because it makes people more equal. Those who have more than their fair share have to give it back. What could possibly be wrong with leveling the playing field? Who's against equality? When framed that way, socialism is made to seem the only moral choice. So if you're opposed to it, you're framed as regressive, selfish, and pretty much a jerk. Another example of framing is the issue of religious freedom. The American Civil Liberties Union website says that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment gives you the right to worship or not as you choose. The government can't penalize you because of your religious beliefs. It sounds good, but only because of the framing. The Constitution doesn't speak about the right to worship and to hold beliefs. Those are a given. The Constitution specifically defends the free exercise of religion, and that means freedom to act on your religious beliefs and not to be forced to violate them. And that also includes the right to influence others, just as secular people can. Yet people who want to exercise their religion in these ways are framed as bigots. Martin Castro, former chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights for the Obama administration, wrote that religious freedom is a code word for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. So even if courts uphold your religious freedom, you're still a hater. Speaking of hate speech is another example of framing. Hate speech is not free speech is a common refrain on college campuses. And what counts as hate speech? Whatever people who say hate speech is not free speech find hateful. And that number is growing at an alarming pace, according to several recent studies. There are many other examples. People who question climate change policies are framed as science deniers. People who oppose abortion, even late-term abortion in a healthy pregnancy, are framed as waging a war on women. So how does someone who wants to present the other side of these arguments deal with this framing tactic? First, reject biased framing. Now that you know what framing is, you'll be able to spot it. That's half the battle. Say something like, "Do you think that's the whole story? Let me suggest another way of looking at it." Second, get yourself up to speed on the big issues. Don't expect someone else to fight your battles. Read up, memorize some bullet points. You know what they're going to say. You hear their arguments all day in the major media and in your classrooms. But here's where you have an edge. It is unlikely they've ever heard your arguments. You might be surprised what happens when they do. Third, set some basic ground rules. Bury the insults. No name-calling. General statements are fine, but they need to be backed up with examples. Make it clear that you're prepared to hear their arguments. In turn, they have to commit to hear yours. And then, may the best argument win. If nobody budges, that's fine. You've had a respectful exchange of ideas. If nothing else, that's a victory for civil discourse, and we certainly could use more of that. Just don't forget to look out for biased frames. They're great for making movies, but not for finding truth. I'm Jeff Myers, president of Summit Ministries for Prager University.
The communist government of the former Soviet Union thought that by controlling access to information, they could keep their citizens in line. Consistent with the Orwellian nature of the Soviet Union, the country's most important newspaper was Pravda. Pravda is the Russian word for truth. But Pravda was not truth. It was full of lies. But here's the thing. Almost no one in the Soviet Union was fooled. They knew they were being lied to. Ironically, unlike most citizens in the Soviet Union, citizens in 21st century America are fooled by their news media. We think we're getting the real story from our major media, but we're not. When we tune into the networks or read the New York Times or the Washington Post, we're actually getting a sharply slanted version of the news, slanted to the left. This should deeply concern people on both sides of the political divide. To make informed decisions, a free society needs a press it can trust, not one that is hopelessly biased. In 2017, Project Veritas sent out undercover reporters to see how committed the major media was to objective news gathering, specifically as it regarded the newly elected president, Donald Trump. Our first report focused on CNN. A producer there, John Bonifield, acknowledged the lack of evidence for his network's efforts to link the Trump campaign and the Russian government in a plot to rig the 2016 election. Bonifield told us, "I think the president is probably right to say, look, you are witch hunting me. You have no smoking gun. You have no real proof." So why was CNN so relentless in hammering the Russia collusion narrative? Ideology, the election wasn't legitimate, and ratings. As Bonifield noted, the Trump-Russia collusion story was good for business. Next, we released another series of reports, these on the New York Times. First, we heard from Nick Dudick, the paper's audience strategy editor. Dudick told our undercover reporter he was responsible for choosing which New York Times videos go on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Dudick boasted, "My imprint is on every video we do." And what was that imprint about? As Dudick, who worked on both the Obama and Hillary Clinton campaigns, told our reporter, he hoped to use his position to make the president's life as difficult as possible. "I will be objective," he told our reporter with undisguised sarcasm before revealing his true intentions. "No, I'm not. That's why I'm here." Dudick told us he returned to journalism precisely in order to remain politically active. Next, we met Des Shu, an editor for the paper. She made it clear where she stood. "I think one of the things that maybe journalists were thinking about is if we write about Trump and how insanely crazy he is and how ludicrous his policies are, then maybe people will read it and be like, oh wow, we shouldn't vote for him." According to the Times' own handbook on journalistic ethics, journalists may not do anything that damages the Times' reputation for strict neutrality in reporting on politics and government. So given such a breach of the Times' own standards, we expected the newspaper to come down hard on Dudek and Chu. Instead, they came down hard on us. Executive editor Dean Baquet said I was a despicable person for recording one of his employees telling the truth. Yet, when the Times publicized a 2012 undercover video of Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney saying that 47% of Americans wouldn't vote for him because they were dependent on the government, they praised it as offering a rare glimpse of Romney's personal views. In fact, in his attack on us, Baquet unwittingly gave the whole American media game away. A real journalist, he told a panel at the National Press Club, has to have in his or her heart a desire to make society better. The Times' editor is wrong. Real journalists want to pursue the truth. Then they let the citizens use that truth to build a better society. When journalists shape news to fit their vision of a better society, they're not doing their job. Perhaps this wouldn't be so bad if the major media would just admit their political motives. But they don't. On behalf of their own narrow agenda, they lie, distort, and exaggerate. And they expect us to call it Pravda. But with each passing day, fewer and fewer Americans are willing to do so. I'm James O'Keefe, founder and president of Project Veritas for Prager University.
They're turning social media against us, using it to influence our elections, spreading propaganda, disguising it as news. Pretty scary stuff. I'm not talking about Russia, that's amateur hour. The media organization I'm talking about operates right here in the USA, out in the open, legally. It has a large staff of on-air personalities, reporters, cameramen, and editors. It operates out of state-of-the-art studios in Washington, D.C., London, Rio, and half a dozen other major cities. It produces videos, news reports, and documentaries. It has tens of millions of social media followers. Their content is viewed and shared by countless young people across the Western world. In short, they're targeting us. CNN, right? Wrong. Fox News? Wrong again. The answer is AJ+. If you've spent time on social media, you've seen their stuff, I promise you. This isn't the work of a scrappy startup in Silicon Valley. AJ+ is bankrolled by the government of Qatar. Never heard of Qatar? Most people haven't. It's a tiny Persian Gulf state with lots of oil money. Billions of dollars they're not afraid to spend on causes they believe in. Causes like the terror group Hamas, which runs the Gaza Strip. Without billions from Qatar and its ally Iran, Hamas would blow away in the next desert sandstorm. But Hamas is only part of Qatar's terror portfolio. The Qatar government bankrolls the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda in Yemen and Syria, radical extremists in Libya, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In other words, a rogues gallery of murderous Islamist terror groups. Qatar's propaganda arm is the Arab news service Al Jazeera, which it owns lock, stock, and America-hating, Israel-hating barrels. Al Jazeera made a splashy attempt to break into the US media market in 2013. They bought a cable franchise for $400 million from former Vice President Al Gore. They signed up some major American TV journalists and opened up shop in New York and Washington. But the effort failed. Americans just couldn't cozy up to the idea that a news network they had rightly associated with Osama bin Laden could be trusted. But Al Jazeera didn't disappear. They just rebranded into the much nicer sounding AJ+, and they concentrated their efforts on the internet and a market that didn't have a bin Laden fixation or much connection to 9/11 at all. Young people. And they've been amazingly successful. Their productions are well-produced, slick, and left. In fact, they're so left that they make videos railing against leftist white women for being insufficiently sympathetic to leftist women of color, especially women of color who are gay or transgendered. It's hard to ignore the irony that a media operation fully funded by a country that oppresses women and gays makes this kind of content for an American audience. But the irony goes deeper. The young and hip presenters at AJ+ depict America as racist through and through, past and present. Black Lives Matter has no greater media ally than AJ+, nor do avowed socialists like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AJ Plus jumped on her bandwagon early on, making a video in the summer of 2018 about then-candidate Ocasio-Cortez entitled Socialist Rising. Why, you might ask, would the government of a Middle Eastern country care about influencing young Americans? The answer is this. Anything that weakens the US is a victory for them and their radical form of Islam. If they can convince young Americans that the US is a bad place, young Americans are less likely to defend it and less likely to support its efforts to fight Islamic terror. And if America is bad, then anyone it supports must also be bad. America supports Israel. Qatar, like its allies in the Iranian theocracy, wants Israel destroyed. So AJ Plus turns out video after video, news report after news report, portraying the democratic, free liberal Israel as a repressive apartheid state, despite the fact that Muslims living in Israel have more rights, such as freedom of expression and the equality of women and gays, than Muslims living in Qatar. In AJ Plus's world, Israel attacks their peaceful neighbors in Gaza for no good reason. No need to mention the rocket attacks randomly directed at Israeli civilians. Weaken America, weaken Israel. To Qatar, a few $1 billion for a few decades is a cheap price to pay if it can achieve those goals. But you don't have to play into their game. The next time you see an AJ Plus video or so-called news report, consider the source, or better still, swipe left. I'm Raheem Kassam for Prager University.
Politicians lie. We all know that. This is not an indictment of all politicians, it's simply part of the game. It's our job as informed citizens to figure out the truth. And that's where journalists and the media come in. They are supposed to help us ferret out fact from fiction. So when they get a fact wrong, that's bad. When they get a fact wrong, know it's wrong, and don't correct it, that's worse. That's not getting a fact wrong, that's a lie. And that's journalistic malfeasance. The best, or maybe worst, example of this followed a presidential press conference at Trump Tower on Tuesday, August 15th, 2017. You remember what happened that previous weekend. A group of white supremacists held a white pride rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. The ostensible reason was to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. An Antifa group showed up to counter-protest. The mayor and the police were totally unprepared to deal with the violence that ensued. Tragically, a young woman, Heather Heyer, was run over and killed by a neo-Nazi. The press conference itself was raucous. The media was antagonistic. The president was combative. Out of it all, one phrase eclipsed the thousands of words exchanged. The media reported that President Trump described neo-Nazis as very fine people. Only he didn't. In fact, he didn't even hint at it. Just the opposite. He condemned the neo-Nazis in no uncertain terms. So then, who were the fine people he mentioned? The answer? He was referring to another group of Charlottesville demonstrators who came out that weekend. Protesters who wanted the Robert E. Lee statue removed, and protesters who wanted to keep the statue and restore the park's original name. This is what President Trump said about those peaceful protesters. You also had some very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue, and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. A few moments later, in case there would be any misunderstanding, he makes his meaning even more explicit. I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists. They should be condemned totally. Lest you have any doubts that good people were in Charlottesville to protest the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, the New York Times confirmed it in a story they published the next day, August 16th. Good people can go to Charlottesville, said Michelle Percy, a night shift worker at a Wichita, Kansas retirement home who drove all night with a conservative group that opposed the planned removal of a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. After listening to Mr. Trump on Tuesday, she said it was as if he had channeled her and her friends who had no interest in standing with Nazis or white supremacists. There's another simple test that we can employ to prove that the president was not referring to the neo-Nazis as fine people. It's so obvious, it's painful to mention. The president's daughter and son-in-law are Orthodox Jews. His grandchildren are Jewish. And if that's still not enough to convince you, how about this? Does anyone believe that Donald Trump thinks they're a good Antifa? The leftist thugs who were counter-protesting the neo-Nazi thugs? After all, if those two groups were the only ones involved, and there were fine people on both sides, that means the president believed that there were fine Antifa people. Even MSNBC should have found that hard to swallow. Again, the very fine people on both sides President Trump described at the press conference were the people who wanted to remove the Robert E. Lee statue and the people who wanted to keep it. Both of these groups were nonviolent protesters, fine people with very different ideological views. The scandal of Charlottesville is not what President Trump said about neo-Nazis. It's what the media said President Trump said about neo-Nazis. It's a scandal because news reporting is supposed to be about gathering facts, not promoting an agenda. In Charlottesville, they got it exactly backwards. We have been living with the consequences ever since. Plainly put, ABC, CBS, NBC, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the others spread a malicious lie that has poisoned our national dialogue. They should apologize to the American people for what they have done. Don't hold your breath. Actually, I have a better idea. Let out a big sigh of relief, because now you know the truth. I'm Steve Cortez, CNN political commentator and columnist for Real Clear Politics for Prager University.
One of the most significant events of this century happened in the early afternoon of August 9, 2014. It took place in Ferguson, Missouri, a city on the outskirts of St. Louis. So embedded in the popular mind is this event that if you just say the name Ferguson, everyone knows what you're talking about: police brutality and racial injustice. President Barack Obama referred to it in a speech before the United Nations in September 2014. I know the world also took notice of the small American city of Ferguson, Missouri, where a young man was killed and a community was divided. So yes, we have our own racial and ethnic tensions. The president understated the case. The shooting in Ferguson led to nights of riots and gave fuel to a new social movement, Black Lives Matter. Given its historical importance, it would be useful then to make sure we have our facts straight. So, here's a quiz to test your knowledge. First question, true or false? A young unarmed black man, Michael Brown, 19, was killed by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. The answer is true. True or false? Wilson stopped Brown for no good reason. False. Wilson, driving a police SUV, had just received a call on his radio that a local convenience store had been robbed. He saw two men walking in the middle of the nearby street who met the description of the store thieves. Wilson drove up to them. When he asked the two men to move to the sidewalk, one of the men, Michael Brown, refused. Officer Wilson then attempted to get out of his car, but Brown blocked the door, punching the officer through the open window. As Brown tried to grab Wilson's gun, a struggle ensued. Wilson managed to fire his gun, wounding Brown in the hand. True or false? Michael Brown's back was turned to Officer Wilson when he was shot and killed. False. After being shot in the hand, Brown ran away from the police car. Wilson got out of the vehicle and pursued him. Brown then suddenly turned and charged Officer Wilson. Here's how one witness whose testimony closely fits the forensic evidence described the scene. Brown ran towards the officer full charge. The officer fired several shots at him, and Mike Brown continuously came forward in the charging motion. And when he stopped, that's when the officer ceased fire. When he charged once more, the officer returned fire with, I would say, 3 to 4 shots. And that's when Mike Brown finally collapsed. The Brown family's own medical expert, respected pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, also conceded this point. The wounds Brown suffered were consistent with Brown charging toward Wilson, not running away. True or false? Before Michael Brown was shot and killed, he raised his hands above his head and shouted, "Hands up, don't shoot." False. Federal investigators from the Department of Justice found no credible evidence that Brown ever raised his hands in a don't shoot gesture or in any way heeded the officer's commands for him to surrender. The federal report concluded that witnesses who originally stated Brown had his hands up in surrender recanted their original accounts, admitting that they did not witness the shooting or parts of it. Investigators also concluded Brown never uttered the now iconic phrase. Again from the report, the media has widely reported that there is witness testimony that Brown said "don't shoot" as he held his hands above his head. In fact, our investigation did not reveal any eyewitness who stated that Brown said "don't shoot." Where did this phrase come from then? The best guess is that it was made up by Brown's companion, Dorian Johnson, immediately after the shooting. Witnesses described him saying, "The police shot my friend and his hands were up." And like a game of telephone, the phrase spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, morphing into "hands up, don't shoot." Picked up and amplified by the media, it then became an anthem for activists. True or false? A local grand jury investigation and a federal investigation both concluded that Officer Wilson was justified in his use of force. True. The local grand jury and the federal investigation, supervised by Attorney General Eric Holder, reached the same conclusion. Officer Wilson did nothing wrong. There was no basis on which to prosecute him. Here's how Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute put it in her book, The War on Cops. It was not a question of evidence not supporting high-threshold civil rights charges. It was a question of evidence eviscerating virtually every aspect of the pro-Brown, anti-Wilson narrative. There's another way to put this. The statement that an innocent black man was killed by a racist cop in Ferguson, Missouri, is a lie. Those who say otherwise are either willfully deceiving you for their own purposes or are wholly ignorant of the facts. Now you know. Act accordingly. I'm Larry Elder for Prager University.
Imagine a group of activists so powerful that they could beam their propaganda directly into your brain. Now also imagine that they're so sophisticated they actually get you to pay them to do it. Unfortunately, you don't have to imagine it. It's real. It's Hollywood. As big as the internet has become, Hollywood, and here I'm talking specifically about television, is still king. Not only does it reach hundreds of millions of people with its messaging, it embeds that messaging in seemingly innocuous stories. Stories that distract us from the hardships of daily life, stories that make us feel good, compassionate, and decent. We watch TV, in other words, because we like it. And just as Americans didn't think much about the carcinogens in the cigarettes they smoked for decades, most Americans don't think much about the toxic politics in the television they watch. But those who create that content do. They spin out hour after hour of slickly produced left-wing propaganda, and they give themselves awards for doing it. They applaud each other's courage, even though all their friends think exactly as they do. I spoke with nearly 100 members of the Hollywood community when I wrote my book, Primetime Propaganda, and many of them openly admitted they inserted social justice messages into their shows. How they do it is both clever and effective. Hollywood writers, producers, directors, actors create characters we keep wanting to spend time with, then have those characters act in ways most of us would judge wrong. Then, in effect, they ask us a question. Isn't it really okay that Rachel from Friends decided to have a baby without first marrying Ross? After all, you like Ross and you like Rachel. How can what they do be bad? It hasn't always been this way. For decades, Hollywood promoted traditional American values. That changed, as did so much else in the late 1960s and 70s, when Hollywood stopped celebrating American values and started transforming them. For example, in the early 1970s, abortion was a hotly contested issue. A year before the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case, the top-rated TV sitcom Maude featured a storyline in which the title character of the show has an abortion. The LA Times described it as a watershed moment in TV history. Why? Well, because it removed the stigma of abortion. Millions of Americans, sitting in their living rooms, saw a beloved character do something they did not approve of, and they felt sympathy. Something similar happened in the early 2000s. Vice President Joe Biden was right when he said that Will and Grace had a major impact on how Americans think about same-sex marriage. Before the hit NBC show, though most Americans had a live and let live attitude toward private sexual behavior, few supported the idea of men marrying men or women marrying women. But seeing the charming and funny Will Truman live his life week after week paved the way for a much wider acceptance of same-sex marriage. Current shows like Orange is the New Black and Transparent are trying to effect the same change on the issue of transgenderism. You may think these are all good things, or that some are and some aren't. That's not my point. My point is that Hollywood has had a tremendous influence on our culture, and that influence has been all to the left side of the political spectrum. And it isn't just social issues. Chevy Chase liked to boast that he helped Jimmy Carter defeat Gerald Ford in 1976. He may be right. Week after week on Saturday Night Live, Chase portrayed Ford, probably the most athletic president in American history, as a bumbling, uncoordinated idiot. In the early 2000s, Comedy Central had a show, That's My Bush, that openly mocked the 43rd president. And of course, Hollywood despises Donald Trump. From crime dramas to the late-night comedy shows, he's relentlessly ridiculed. Somehow, Hollywood managed to take an 8-year hiatus from mocking presidents during the Obama years, but maybe that's just a coincidence. All of this programming has an effect. Scientific studies suggest that watching TV acts like a habit-forming drug. According to the market research firm Childwise, teenage boys spend 8 hours per day in front of screens, much of it consuming Hollywood propaganda. Dedicated religious parents might expose their children to 2 hours a week of religious instruction. Hands-on parents might spend 30 minutes a day discussing essential values with their kids. Hollywood gets up to 40 hours a week, every week. By all means, enjoy television. I do. But remember, the people making TV don't merely want to entertain you. They want to influence you. They want you to think like they think. And unless you're aware of what they're trying to do, chances are you will. I'm Ben Shapiro, editor of The Daily Wire for Prager University.
Dear celebrities, I'm sorry to be the one to have to break this to you, but we do not care, not in the slightest particle of an imaginary thing, what you think. If this surprises you, I understand, because, let's be fair, we have played an important role in your delusion. We camp out for days to buy tickets to your sold-out shows, then shout for you to reach down from the stage to touch our hands. Faster than science would believe humanly possible, we learn the lyrics to your every song and master the choreography to your every dance move. We devour your movies, TV shows, and Netflix specials. From that angle, I suppose it's easy to believe that after all the adulation, all the fan mail, and all the magazine covers, you may have actually come to believe that we care what you think. But you're wrong. Nobody cares what you think. Nobody. Well, maybe your mother and your therapist do, but we don't. Not even a little. Allow me to spell this one out for you. I go to a Lady Gaga concert to hear her belt out tunes that remind me of my messy college days. But watching her desperate protest against the results of a free and fair election? Hardly an event I'd ever care to see again in my lifetime. I follow Beyoncé because, let's face it, nobody does a breakup anthem better. But can someone please tell me why I should care if she's for Hillary or for Garfield the cat? And here's to you, Marc Jacobs. You design a killer pair of shoes, but as a political philosopher, you leave a lot to be desired. In fact, it's difficult to comprehend why you thought it necessary to publicly refuse to dress our First Lady. And to the scores of celebrities who threaten to move out of the country if we don't vote your way, wow. Just how long on a private jet must one travel to reach that level of narcissism? This may rock your glittery world, but we don't care whether you stay in America or move to another country. Why would we care where you live? On the one hand, we should find all of this amusing, but on the other, it's actually deeply offensive. It's offensive that you confuse our admiration for blind faith. When Eminem raps, I have to either pick him or the President of the United States, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Which is why it's important that I take this moment to offer each and every one of you celebs a free ride back down to planet Earth. What happens outside of your gated communities, chauffeured SUVs, and personal assistant's iPhone is the real world. It's the rest of us working very hard to earn a living, working toward that weekend break when we can perhaps afford to treat ourselves to your concerts, your movies, and your handbags. You see, we want to enjoy what you do. Sing, dance, act, design. It's a wonderful gift you have, and it's extremely valuable, not only to you, but to us. Entertaining people, making them laugh or cry, is something that you should take pride in. You enrich our world with your talent. But when you go on a political rant on late night TV or call your fans racist and sexist, my God, these people are your fans. Just because they don't think or vote the way you want them to? You cross a line. You lose touch with reality. You become just another shill for another politician. And who wants to be a fan of that? I'm Candace Owens for Prager University.
The media needs more balance in coverage and a wider range of viewpoints represented in every newsroom, at every level, and in each position. In the past few years, I haven't felt proud to be a member of the media. I'm sure there are other journalists out there who feel the same way. I found myself reading news copy that I didn't believe was fully truthful or only told part of the story. And I began to feel that I was contributing to the fear and division in this country by continuing on in this profession. It's been a serious struggle for me, and I no longer want to do this job anymore.
You've probably heard a lot of people recently screaming and yelling about fake news. Charges fly from all points on the political spectrum. This story is mistaken. It's fake news. That statement is incorrect. It's fake news. But to my mind, these arguments miss the point. Mainstream American news is all fake because the major news outlets are so consistently biased toward the left that whether any given story they report is factual or not, their overall reportage is essentially leftist propaganda. You can complain about the right-wing slant of Fox News all you want, but left-wing ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, and CNN have combined almost 10 times the viewers. Look, the chief journalist at ABC is former Clinton operative George Stephanopoulos. The president of CBS News is David Rhodes, the brother of a former senior Obama staffer. Comcast, which owns NBC, is run by a major Democrat donor. Same for the leadership at CBS and Time Warner, which owns CNN. Only 7% of American journalists identify as Republican. And while a lot of news outlets forbid their reporters to donate to candidates, 96% of those who did donate last time out gave to Hillary Clinton. These journalists claim that despite the fact they're all Democrats, they can be objective. It just ain't so. Psychologists have shown that when people associate almost exclusively with those who agree with them, they suffer from groupthink and confirmation bias and lose their ability to see events clearly. Now, it's not that these journalists are liars, exactly. It's that their bias skews their reporting in very specific ways.